So I read Yesteryear. If you've heard anything about this book, you've probably heard that it is the tradwife book. To elaborate a little bit on that synopsis, because of course it's very, very brief and doesn't really tell you a whole lot, the idea behind Yesteryear is that we are looking at the inherent contradiction when it comes to a person who is presenting a traditional lifestyle that is outside the means of technology, but they are able to live this lifestyle and make money off of this lifestyle through technology, more specifically through being an influencer. This is where we are introduced to our protagonist of the story named Natalie. She lives on this beautiful renovated farm, but it's renovated to look older. She has a loving husband. She has beautiful, loving children. She has the perfect life, seemingly, from what she presents on her social media page. She has kind of built this empire for herself, and her life at every moment of every day is essentially not only her trying to determine what can I market about this moment, but also how can I then make money off of it. This leads to the question of, is anything real? Is anything authentic? In order to interrogate the idea of the authenticity, the speculative angle of this book is, what if this woman was forced to go back in time to the very place that she is presenting to her audience as a greater time, the thing we need to return to? What if she actually was forced to return to that time? What would that look like? Before diving further into the writing or the character or the themes, I do want to start with how this book has been marketed, what I saw presented versus what I think you actually are getting. So I want to start with the very concept of it being satire, and also some misconceptions about satire, but also how I think those misconceptions are not necessarily, in this case, incorrect to have based off of how the book has been presented. So it has been presented as not only satire, but funny. And satire does not have to be funny. It often is. However, sometimes it is just a cutting, witty way to hold a mirror up to our society and to reflect on things, sometimes in an absurd way, but it doesn't necessarily have to be tee-hee, ha-ha, this is so amusing. It doesn't have to be presented that way. However, the book, in its very synopsis, is stated as being funny. Humor is subjective, so maybe you will find the book funny. There's the occasional line, in my opinion, that was kind of funny, or sometimes certain reactions, because they were so absurd, it was kind of funny. But if you think of something like Parks and Rec versus Veep, if you're familiar with those two shows, definitely leaning more in the Veep camp, where everybody is pretty awful, things feel really hopeless and bleak, but the very presentation of it in such a raw way is at times funny, but that is depending on your sense of humor, and not everybody really connects with that. This one is kind of a descent. You really dwell in the ugly sides of being a person. The book is through first-person narration of our protagonist throughout the entire book. She is extremely unlikable. She's also a pretty troubled person, I would say, so then you feel odd looking at her and being like, oh my gosh, this lady, because you also are like, well, and you feel this conflict in you for how you're judging her, but at the same time you're like, I think we should be judging her. And so I want to get into that in a little bit, but I first want to talk about the themes of this, because I think this ties a little bit with how it's been marketed and its presentation. I think so much of it seems as though it's going to be centered around a critique of, as noted, the idea of, I am living a certain life that I think was from the past and shows the past was better, but I'm only able to have this life because of the money that modern day things provide for me. And also, in this book's case, because she is a woman that is presenting traditional values, one of the values she's presenting is, I'm a homemaker, I'm not the breadwinner, except for she is the breadwinner because of the fact that she's making a ton of money. Again, kind of cosplaying off of this idea of a woman of the past. And she has the agency and the freedom to do this, so it seems like most of the themes are going to be tied to that. And I think that it's not as though those are absent, or that isn't part of the focus of the story, but I think there is an actual theme that is more the through line to every other theme in this, which is the idea of the psychological effects of a religiously prescribed as well as a self-inflicted panopticon. If you've never heard of a panopticon, the idea is this prison system where there is this guard tower in the center, and then all of the cells are in a circle around the guard tower, and you can see into them. You only have one individual in the guard tower, so that one individual can't literally be looking at every single person within their cell at any given time. However, if you are one of the prisoners within your cell, even though you know that you can't literally be being watched every moment of every day, you still have the possibility at any moment of any day of being watched. We usually think of panopticon in modern day terms when it comes to, if you're talking about like science fiction or this dystopian feel, this surveillance state, or from just an everyday average person's perspective, anytime you walk into a crowded area, there's this feeling of, well, everybody's got a camera on their phone. Anybody can take their phone out and record anything at any time. Or if you're at your house and you're kind of a little paranoid, like, oh my gosh, what if our devices are listening? This idea that you're always being assessed and you're always being watched. With the religiously prescribed panopticon, this ties into the fact that our protagonist has grown up with a religious background. So there's this idea that God is always with her, God is always watching, and beyond that, God knows her every single thought. So she'll have a thought, she'll have an ugly thought, and then she'll be like, sorry, Lord, sorry, Lord. She has that sort of mindset constantly. So she has this before she ever has her little social media empire. Not really little, it's enormous. It's an oxymoron to say it's little and then say empire. But she eventually takes this idea of constantly being watched, always having an audience. And there's almost this, well, I already feel like I have one. I might as well have one. So then she goes on from just feeling that way to creating this constant panopticon for herself through social media. And at all given times, it's a show. And it's her self-soothing because she has to try to find a way to morally rationalize these actions, even though on surface level, most people could look at it and be like, well, that's obviously a lie. It's untrue. Doesn't that go against what you supposedly care about? Doesn't that spit in the face of your morals? And just kind of being in her head as she's convincing herself, no, it definitely doesn't. People need this presentation. We all have to tell stories sometimes. She has all these explanations for her actions, and it all is tied back to this. But when I say psychological effects, this is not a healthy way to live your life. This idea of no moment is yours, no moment is private, no moment at any point can be you being yourself. You can't ever relax. What does that do to a person? And that is, I think, the major theme of the story. This also is, of course, tied to many other things. First off, there is the idea of sexism, both being a victim of it and also being one to perpetuate it through how she chooses to live her life. Part of what leads her down this route and part of what makes her think this is an acceptable lane to go down is this idea of what a woman's role is and the acceptable places that women are allowed to take up. However, she then goes on to be judgmental of other individuals who she deems as not living in the way that women are supposed to live. We already kind of has touched on the idea of perception versus authenticity and reality by extension, but there are many other pockets within that. So for example, relationships, motherhood, parenthood in general, sexuality, gender, and mental health especially. And also your general demeanor, the things that you allow yourself to want versus what maybe you actually want. And then even simply your personality. What personality are you allowed to have as a married person, as a woman, as a mother? And I think one thing that people naturally will have questions about before diving into this book is this book trying to make a mockery of all religious women or religion in general? And I do think the book went out of its way to actually have moments where other individuals in the book and also other women in the book, they have found really wonderful things and a lot of healing and a lot of community through religion. I think it's more so looking at, again, I know I've said this multiple times now, but this idea of this like self-inflicted panopticon, this idea of you're always being watched, you always have to put on a show, and what that does to a person, it never allows you to basically exhale and be a person and forgive yourself for being a flawed human being, because we're all going to be flawed, and learning from that and growing from that. You never really get to do that because you're never actually confronting anything of substance. You're never confronting anything real about yourself. So how could you ever grow? You can't even look at yourself honestly. I think that it's not trying to say every person who's ever believed in God, or any person who, I think this is also another thing, any woman who wants to be at home with her children, or who maybe wants to grow her own vegetables, or doesn't want to be as on the grid, or anything like that. It's not saying it's wrong to want certain things for yourself in life. So long as that's what you genuinely want for yourself, there's an acknowledgement that you recognize this isn't an option for everyone due to financial circumstances or just other circumstances in life. There are certain things that allow for certain people to pursue those moments in their lives or those options, those paths. It's not available to everyone, but if you're honest with yourself about what you want, why you want it, and what's available to you versus what's available to others, then at the end of the day, it's your life, it's your business. I don't think the book at all was trying to demean what people want for themselves. It's instead asking, well, what do you actually want? Ignore what everybody tells you you're supposed to want. Ignore what you're supposedly supposed to do and how you're supposed to live based off of all these other things. Instead, just ask for yourself. And also, in the context of a relationship, because she is a married woman, she has kids, she often is not looking at, what does my husband want? Her husband's not really looking at, what does she want? It's constantly like, how can we live up to a certain ideal? That's what they're looking at instead. And when it comes to their kids, those kids don't have any agency. Those kids don't get to... They're also little performers. They're little accessories, is I think a better way to put it. They are accessories to their mother's performance, which is, I think, a good segue into the characterization of this book. Her as a parent, and then her inflicting a lot onto her children. They're like actors to a point where she even documents her birth. She's looking at the birth of one of her children, I should say, not her own birth. That would be a lot of foresight. She is looking at how can I profit off of the birth of one of my children, and also maybe if I do an at-home birth, then I can profit off of that, and I can present that. It's always from the moment they are born. She is looking at how she can use them. And she doesn't see it that way, and you're in her head, so you can see she doesn't see it that way, but if you take a step back, or not even, because it's pretty obvious, you can see it, and then that's when you're like, okay, I wanted you, for your own sake, as well as other people's sake, I wanted you to allow yourself to heal and to grow, and I'm really having a hard time now because I see that you are really destroying your children's lives through your actions. And it's not that you have to then have children enter the picture in order to criticize her or have negative feelings towards a lot of the things she's doing. But the point I'm trying to make is that she is an exceptionally flawed person. People are going to feel a few different ways about her because it is meant to be a reflection of how human beings actually get to the places that they do. There are going to be things about her that you pity or that you feel sympathy for, and there are going to be things about her that you're disgusted by. Maybe you'll be more disgusted than you are sympathetic, but regardless, because she is shown to have a more fully fleshed out characterization, I think some people will think the author didn't do enough to criticize her, and then I think some people will think the author didn't do enough to show sympathy to her. It's almost like, well, we didn't make her cartoonishly evil, we also didn't make her a perfect person, so because she lies somewhere in the middle, I think that's gonna rub a lot of people the wrong way. And that is a personal preference. I don't think there's anything wrong with being so disgusted by this person. I don't think there's anything wrong with deciding, like, I wish the author had been harder on her. And I also don't think there's anything wrong with being like, I wish the author would have cut her some slack, because some of what she has been told her whole life, and the lack of a support system, and the inability to sometimes seek out guidance or help from anyone around her, I don't know, how was she supposed to get out of this? I think that those are all valid takeaways. It's just a matter of how you personally feel about it. I appreciated showing a character like this because I like when we have an accurate reflection about how humans get to a point that they do, because nobody is born all good or all evil. We're just people, and there's the nature versus nurture angle, which the book is exploring, and you're just watching as it progresses down a certain path and what that looks like. But again, personal preferences, everybody's going to have different feelings about this character. I think a succinct way to summarize this is through a often overused statement online, but it is applicable here, which is the idea of two things can be true at once. She can be partaking in some pretty awful acts, and she can also be a product of awful acts that have been placed onto her. Part of the characterization too, though, is through the writing. and it is first person. So I do want to note, if you are a huge fan of beautiful, lush descriptions, you're not really going to get that because it is so in her head and it's very conversational. So the writing isn't necessarily through the word choice and the sentence structure that you might like it or dislike it. It's more so the voice of the character. That is fully what it is taking on. And so if you were to pull passages from this, some of them might be, to return to how I was describing it before in the context of satire, some of it might be cutting, some of it might be really raw, but it's not probably going to be really beautiful and poetic. That is not the writing within this. It is so heavily in every way tied to our character. And also, because of this, she is a very unreliable narrator to the extreme. And part of the difficulty with an unreliable narrator, I think anyway, is that authors have their own feelings about the characters. Authors have their own feelings about what they're even talking about in the story. And it's up to the author to decide how much of their own personal feelings they put into it. When you have an unreliable narrator and you're exploring a very flawed person through this sort of narration, the author has to take a moment to take a step back and be like, even if I don't like what she's doing, if I don't condone what she's doing, I still have to write it where she's going to rationalize it in her own head. And sometimes readers will take that rationalization and they will decide that it must be a version of condoning. And it's up for interpretation. That is not the interpretation I had. I think this was purely this character and this character's voice. If you do not like being in characters' heads like that, this might not be the book for you. But I think we're exploring, I think we're trying to be very honest. Ironically, given that the entire narration is through the perspective of somebody who is not being honest with themselves and is always putting on a show, I think we are trying to honestly portray what that looks like. Some other reasons, though, why you might dislike this, if you maybe even want the author to take a little bit more agency in their own themes and you want them to present it a little bit. I'm not trying to imply like, oh, if you want your hand held and you want everything to be black and white and have no nuance, that's not what I'm trying to say. I just mean that sometimes we want it to be a little bit clearer. We want it to be a little bit more of like, I'm going to intervene here and I'm going to try to maybe, meaning the author, place a little bit more so that it's not as up in the air, it's not as up for interpretation. I'm going to make it a little bit more distinct. Some people do have a preference for that. So if that is your preference, less so I think what you're going to get with Yesteryear. Also, if you hate fractured timelines, because obviously, given that we have present day, she's telling you about her life and she's putting on a show at every moment. And then all of a sudden she's transported back to what seems to be a very different time period. And then you're getting all these in-between pieces. Like, how did she get to a point where she lived this life? So you're kind of going back from present day, but not back in time to the point that she's at, where she's actually forced to reckon with this ideal that she was presenting versus what it actually looked like. You're going to have it all over. And some people just do not like fractured timelines like that. So if that's you, this probably isn't going to work for you. The criticism that, I'm not saying any other criticism would be invalid, but the one that maybe I would resonate with the most is that at times I think this book made a little bit of a trade-off between readability and that, oh my gosh, I have to turn the page because I have to know. It maybe leaned into that at times, and I would even argue almost like an entertainment factor. I think at times it leaned into that a little bit above nuance because things get pretty intense is what I'll say, and a little extreme. And I think that created, for that kind of psychological thriller angle, I think it still was tied to the themes that I was talking about. However, I still kind of grapple with some of the way that the plot concluded. I still wonder if I think that ultimately served the themes the best. And I want to give a couple of other books that maybe you might be interested in if you read this and you felt it was compelling, but maybe you wish certain things were done differently, or maybe you really loved it and you're just looking for other books that do similar things. I'm going to mention 3 books, one of which on surface level seems the most related, and I actually think it's the least related, but I'm still going to mention it, which would be Kindred by Octavia Butler. The idea of being a woman is randomly transported back in time. She is a black woman, and she is transported back to a time where she would be a slave. And every time that she is forced to go back, there's this young boy who she initially had saved, and he is growing up, and you're seeing him go from a child to this terrible man. And a lot of the themes of that story are about how both literally and metaphorically we cannot escape the past. And I think that it is exceptional. It is much less satire. It is very, very serious. It's very bleak. And it's less of a look how we're both a victim of the system and we're perpetuating. Not really. It's more just looking at look how we're still affected by the events of the past and how we haven't gotten to a point where it is going to somehow be completely separate from the events that took place before. So you can't really come out of things unscathed. That, I think, on surface level seems the most related, but in tone is very different, and thematically I actually think is also quite different. Such a Fun Age, I think, is probably the closest to this one, but with one specific perspective, because there are several perspectives in that story, and there's one perspective where, similar to this book, you're just like, oh my gosh, stop, and you just want the character to actually take an accurate look at themselves, because they keep trying to justify everything they do, and everything they do gets more ridiculous and absurd, and in that book's case, cringy, where you're just like, oh my gosh, lady, come on. And kind of, I think, would couple well actually with reading this book. If you read this book and then read Such a Fun Age, because this one naturally, I think, is pretty obvious, has some aspects to it that are more so in the conservative area, whereas Such a Fun Age, the lady is like I'm a girl boss feminist. And so looking at how these women feed into certain perceptions and also identities, and then what they actually are like and how it's sometimes in conflict with that. I think both of those books do a good job of that. That's not the only thing about that book. There's a lot more to that book, but that particular perspective, I think, reminded me a little bit of the perspective in Yesteryear. And then the last one I want to recommend, it's extremely nuanced, it's extremely well done, would be The Vanishing Half. That one also, you are looking at how events in a person's life lead them in certain directions. That one, if you were wanting Yesteryear to be a little bit more serious, a little less psychological thriller, and maybe you wanted it to feel a little more understated, but still very poignant and hard-hitting, The Vanishing Half, I think, is a little bit more serious of a book, at least in its tone. And it's not first person, you're not stuck in these people's heads, you're just kind of watching it all unfold, and it is beautiful and heartbreaking and very, very well done. So I think all of those, if you at least had some interest in this book, or maybe you were wanting different things from it a little bit, those options hopefully will fulfill something for you. I think they're all not only good books, but they'd be all really good book club books. But regardless, Yesteryear had a lot within it, and it was a very bleak, ugly portrayal of how we can be. I do think that it's going to be very hard-hitting for a lot of people. I think it's going to be unlike, for a lot of individuals, anything they've read before. And I absolutely understand the hype around this and the popularity around this. And I do think there's a lot to take away from this, a lot of conversations to have about what it's presenting. If you have read the book, feel free to elaborate on your thoughts about it. And if you wanted to talk spoilers, just make sure to write a spoiler tag so that nobody has anything ruined for them. If you're interested in it or the other books I mentioned, I'll have those linked. Thanks so much for watching, though. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.